We'll go from 12 to 12:15.
Now that's mine, but I'm second. Adam's first. So his probably should be up right now. That is my presentation. Now. We're on the right track. We're having slight technical difficulties. Yes, I'm going to do it.
It was never really discussed. I
Corey
can.
thinks Adam's going first.
Corey thinks I'm going. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't know where he
Yeah,
went,
you
but
first.
make sure not.
You're going first.
All right.
All right.
Can't get out of it now.
Here's the final.
Mine's the what?
The final.
I believe so.
So I got out of the
That's so awesome. Thank you. Wow.
Mic check, mic check.
Is there any way to move the what do you call it? This bars and notes are go out? Just test it out. Okay. Great. All right. Are we going and get started now? Or? All right. Thanks, everybody. Bear with me while I get a little organized, please. Good morning. Thank you all for joining me today. My name is Adam Verdon. I'm an attorney with FEMA Region 9. I'll get into what that means in a little bit. And this is special for me to be here today because I was a Pepperdine Law graduate back in 2016. So feels a little weird being on this side of the podium. A little bit of an imposter syndrome going on, but we'll get through it. I was as I was getting dressed this morning, I was like, I think this is the first time I've worn a suit in connection with my actual FEMA role. So kind of funny, but normally when you're at the disaster site, you're in like a polo and khakis, but putting on my very best for you lawyers. So hope you appreciate it. I know we talked a little bit about FEMA in the last presentation. This is going to be a bit of an overview of just kind of FEMA 101. I find anecdotal, so I apologize if it's a bit of a backtrack, but I find that when I talk to people about what I do at FEMA, anecdotally, there's a lot of confusion. People don't really know what FEMA is. They sometimes never even heard of the agency, or if they have, it's usually kind of our more infamous events, response to Hurricane Katrina, response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, and some of those kind of blemishes on our agency. And so I'm hoping that I can at least convey some information about what we do as an agency and provide you a little bit more information that way, because our work is very complex. It's also very valuable to those that need assistance from FEMA. So let's go ahead and get started. This is our mission: helping people before, during, and after disasters. It's a very straightforward mission, right? Pretty simple, gets right to the point. But each of those components, before, during, and after disasters, that's going to be a major feature of our talk today. So one thing that they like to impress upon us, FEMA employees, when we deploy to an event, whenever our administrator, Deanne Criswell, gives a talk to the entire agency, they like to remind us that, when we're out there in the field, we're meeting people on their worst day. Their lives have been completely upended, homes destroyed, the world's upside down. And so we're in a very unique position where we get to help people at that point be a source of some kind of stability in their lives. And so it's a reminder to us to, take that responsibility seriously and to heart. What we do. So in order to answer that question, I'm going to start with who we serve. So, District of Columbia, 5 U.S. territories. It's Puerto Rico, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and American Samoa. We've got 50 states, and sorry, the text got a little screwed up there, but 574 federally recognized tribes. I'm not going to list you all 574 because, to be perfectly honest, I don't know them, but it's the point is we have a lot of constituents that we help in disasters, right? Who we partner with. This is really important because a lot of people think, okay, you're FEMA, you're the federal government, you're going to step in and take the lead and resolve any kind of disaster that arises, and that's not really the case. We work in partnership with our state, our local, our territorial, our tribal partners. Disaster response is a whole community effort, right? We rely on the know-how of our local community members who understand the unique and specific needs of a particular community, and we are there in a support role to help facilitate that. So you'll see in the white box there, emergency management is most effective when it's locally executed, state managed, and federally supported. Pivotal moments in our nation's history. So I was a history major undergrad. I really like history. So I like this slide a lot. I'm going to talk a little bit about FEMA history because it is important to understand, how we've gotten to where we are, how the agency has evolved over time. But we were founded on April 1st, 1979, April Fool's Day, by the Carter administration through executive order. And prior to that, of course, there were still natural disasters that had significant impact on the country, but there was no central agency responsible for disaster assistance coordination. It was a real piecemeal approach, and this was most strongly felt following the 3 Mile Island incident in 1979. That was a partial nuclear meltdown at a power plant in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And the result was there was all this hazardous waste and different materials that were needed to be dealt with. And ultimately, 100 different federal departments and agencies were involved in that process. And that just became unwieldy and very difficult to coordinate. So as a result, Carter issued an executive order and created one central agency, that is FEMA, and we've been continuing on ever since. I'm going to fast forward now to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, right? So FEMA had a direct role in the response and recovery efforts, the rescue efforts at the World Trade Center. We certainly weren't the lead agency in that process, but it was part of our wheelhouse to respond to a disaster like that. And following those attacks, Congress passed the Homeland Security Act of 2002, which created the Department of Homeland Security. And when you think Homeland Security, oftentimes you'll think things like terrorism or border patrol, things like that, but certainly security from natural events, natural disasters fits within that. And so FEMA was absorbed under the DHS umbrella as a result. Following that, the next major event I want to talk about, Hurricane Katrina in 2005. So that was one of the costliest and deadliest disasters in US history. FEMA's response to it was roundly criticized in the media, and there was a lot that went wrong with that event. But one of the positive outcomes of that was Congress passed what's known as the Post-Katrina Emergency Reform Act in 2006. And it's abbreviated as PCEMRA. And I'll stop right there to say, when you join the federal government, you learn just how many acronyms and abbreviations there are. I'm going to do my absolute best to kind of say the full terms before I start incorporating those. But if I do start talking in alphabet soup speak, please stop me, remind me. I'm happy to kind of slow things down and make sure we're all on the same page. I don't want you to just be sitting and wondering what the heck I'm even talking about. But in any event, PCEMRA gets passed in 2006. And one of the important things that does is it creates a uniform system of training and qualification of our FEMA responders, because we have FEMA responders deploying from all across the country. And so we want to make sure that if you're getting a PA specialist from the Northeast or someone from the Gulf or West Coast, they all have the same basic training and understanding of what their role is, and they can use that wherever they are ultimately sent to. Additionally, PCEMRA increased our cooperation with private sector, with nonprofits. And so, as I mentioned before, we are never the leaders in a disaster. We use our relationships with our state and local counterparts, our tribal counterparts, and increasingly more now, even the private sector and nonprofit organizations. Next, let's jump to 2017, Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. They strike Texas, Florida, and Puerto Rico within weeks of each other, create enormous devastation in all of those geographic areas. And one of the things to arise from that was in 2018, we passed the Disaster Relief and Recovery Act. I believe we heard a little bit about that at our last presentation. We're more focused on the individual assisted side. One thing I want to mention is that it also helped allocate more funding towards resiliency and mitigation measures. So prior to disasters striking, more of our budget from the Disaster Relief Fund that is used to fund disaster response can be allocated to help make sure that communities that face the threat of frequent and recurring events like hurricanes or wildfires, they have more money to help withstand those kinds of negative effects, and it becomes a positive investment at the outset. And of course, 2020, we got COVID-19. That was the first time FEMA had a hand in a pandemic type of event. Normally, when you think of a FEMA response, it's because there's some kind of physical damage, right? There's a flood or a hurricane or something where neighborhoods are destroyed, communities are destroyed. Obviously, COVID-19 was completely different. And we had simultaneous disaster declarations from all 50 states, DC, all our territories, Indian tribes, all at once. So it really was a brand new way for us to respond to disasters. And I think the point in saying all this is that our agency's mission has certainly evolved over time. We've certainly faced a lot of challenges over the course of that process, but it's those challenges that make us rethink how we respond to disasters, how we deploy, and we certainly get better as a result of it. So we're not a static agency. We're constantly relearning our roles, and I think we're all the better for it. We're not perfect, but we're improving each step of the way. So how we do it. I'm sitting before a bunch of lawyers, so I figured I should start with the legal authorities, right? Now, all federal agencies are governed by sets of statutes, regulations. Some apply to federal agencies broadly. I'm going to focus on the ones that are specifically related to disaster assistance, okay? So we're going to start with the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, also known as just the Stafford Act. And that really constitutes the statutory authority for most federal disaster response activities, particularly with respect to FEMA programs, because it's not just FEMA that this applies to. When there's a declaration, FEMA is typically the lead federal agency to respond, but we have partnerships with Department of Housing and Urban Development, with go back to COVID with Health and Human Services. So there's a lot of different actors involved, but for FEMA, the Stafford Act is really kind of speaking to that wheelhouse. And then you have Title 44, Code of Federal Regulations, CFR. And if you recall from law school, the difference between a statute and a regulation, statutes are passed by Congress, they enact laws, they provide the overall framework that governs our agency. But the regulations are the rules that really get into the specifics of what our agency does, how we carry out that framework, and they're developed by the agencies because they're really the subject matter experts and understand how we accomplish those goals. So, here's a copy of the Stafford Act. It's fairly, thin. And here's a copy of Code of Federal Regulations. It's voluminous, gets really into those specifics. They all cover the same grounds, but one really shows how those regulations get implemented. Of course, we also have White House policies, executive orders, national security policy. Again, we fit within that DHS umbrella. So that's going to be relevant to us. Office of Management and Budget memos. So, when we deploy folks to different disasters, issues like per diem and how we fund travel, those kinds of issues come up. And so that's why, those types of policies will govern us as well. And then we have FEMA policies. So you heard a lot about one of our two major programs during the last presentation is individual assistance and public assistance, okay? So public assistance focuses on the rebuilding and repairing of infrastructure, those, roads, bridges, schools, those public services that help the whole community, right? The type of work that you all be doing is probably more based in the individual assistance program, when specific individuals, homeowners, renters, when they get affected by a disaster on an individual level, those are going to be the types of programs that they will need assistance with. All right, so I mentioned before our motto, right? Our slogan, helping people before, during, and after disasters. So how do we do it before? Well, I kind of alluded to this initially, but we want to make sure that our communities are in the best possible place they can be before the disaster ever strikes. It's obviously the ideal situation. And flooding events tend to affect the country on a far more regular basis than typically any other disaster. So hurricanes, floods, things like that. We are able to map where these kinds of flooding hotspots are located. And we have this program called the Nfip and National Flooding Insurance Program. What they do is they identify these hotspots. They offer homeowners with flood insurance, because often getting that in the private sector can be near impossible or prohibitively expensive. We encourage communities to adopt new standards to help mitigate issues in the future. I'd mentioned that Disaster Relief and Recovery Act from 2018. So one of the positives that came from that was this new program called Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC. And what BRIC does is it increased our allotment of disaster funds for specifically preparation ahead of disaster. So when you go back to 2017, Harvey, Irma, and Maria, the estimates are like those three hurricanes cost about $250 billion in damage, right? That's a lot of money, very expensive. And you're not even talking about the psychological effects, the lives lost, things like that. So in order to lessen and mitigate those effects, a lot more FEMA funds are geared towards those efforts you can take up front to avoid that. Training and educating. So we, again, work with our state and local partners constantly, running exercises and planning for future events. But one program I'm particularly proud of is called Fema Core. It's a partnership between FEMA and AmeriCorps And AmeriCorps is a program that recruits typically college-age youths to go into more poverty-stricken and lower income areas and be of service to the community in the United States. Fema Core is kind of the same concept, except we take college-age kids who have an interest in emergency management. They deploy with FEMA, help get folks signed up for disaster assistance, learn the program, they get an education stipend as a result of it. And often it becomes a great recruiting tool for us down the road because we have all this institutional knowledge. We obviously want to retain that and help grow our workforce that way. So it's a really great program for everybody. All right, how about during disasters? So the major components that we monitor, we call them lifelines whenever there's a disaster declaration. The lifeline is really the key sectors of a community that are needed to maintain operations. So we're talking power, medical, shelter, transportation, communication, things like that. We need to make sure as soon as possible, if these different lifelines have been knocked down, we get them up and running because that's really the lifeblood of any community. And we can't really get into the recovery process until that's done. So that's really our primary focus on the outset of a disaster. But we also work on delivering immediate emergency assistance. So we have what are called response coordination centers. At headquarters in DC, we have the National Response Coordination Center. And then at each of our 10 FEMA regions, there's a regional response coordination center. And that is where if we get a request from the ground, from the field that, hey, we need some supplies, commodities, personnel, those get filtered through those coordination centers. And then we task the appropriate, either if it's a resource that FEMA has on hand, then we will deliver it ourselves, or we will then mission assign another federal agency or state component to go and carry out that request on our behalf. And then, sorry, there's like a little cut off there, but it's supposed to say ensure continuity of government, because, if it gets to the point where the lights go out somewhere, I mean, DC, it's a very powerful city, right? There's a lot of important players there. And if something happens, an event, I mean, I remember when I was working at headquarters, we had to go shelter in place because all of a sudden a tornado appeared out of nowhere. And we thought, I'm a California kid, I never experienced that before. So that was new for me. But in the event of a major event, FEMA is in charge of making sure that our government carries on and there are locations and places for those kinds of operations to continue. So it's obviously a very, very important role, one that we don't take lightly, but something just to be aware of. And I'm going to continue on with what we do during disaster. So this is a disaster legal services conference. I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention it a little bit. But disaster legal services, it's a program, part of our individual assistance component. It's authorized under Section 415, the Stafford Act, implemented by 44 CFR Section 206-164. And essentially what it is, it's a agreement between FEMA and the Young Lawyers Division of the American Bar Association. And it's used to provide free, non-fee legal services to low-income individuals and others impacted by a disaster who don't necessarily have the means to seek representation or counsel another way. And so the types of things you heard a little bit in our last presentation, but appealing FEMA decisions if there's a negative outcome with the grant application, certainly that's a role for our disaster legal services program to assist with. In the event of a fire or some other kind of catastrophe, you don't really have access to your important documentation like wills or property titles, things like that. They can help with drafting those kinds of documents or finding other avenues to get assistance in light of those missing or destroyed information. Fraud was kind of mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, a disaster site is a breeding ground for kind of predators to prey on both the agency, but also particularly the most vulnerable in society. And so, you can get counseling services to help avoid kind of phishing schemes or other kinds of fraudulent schemes that may otherwise take advantage of survivors seeking assistance and thinking they're doing the right thing when in fact there's some kind of manipulation going on. So it's a really important program, and one that is available whenever there's a major disaster declaration. What about after disasters? So one thing that I wanted to talk about, it's not quite really on this slide, but we have what's called our local hire program. And what that is once you get into more of the recovery phase, FEMA goes into the community and recruits residents and survivors of a disaster just to give them an opportunity to work for FEMA. And it's a really important program because it helps them feel like they're contributing to the rebuilding of their society. They have a stable income that way, and they are helping restore the balance and normalcy in their lives. And also, obviously, we benefit because we have these services that need to get done. Sometimes disaster recovery takes years, right? So, well after the news cameras have left, we're still there processing grants applications and things like that. And so we need that kind of workforce. And oftentimes, it also becomes a recruitment tool to build that well of talent just based on folks who experienced a disaster directly themselves. All right, who we are. So we're an agency of over 22,000 employees located across the United States. We have a permanent fixture office, our headquarters office in DC, as well as 10 other regional offices throughout the US. I mentioned at the outset, I work for FEMA Region 9. So Region 9 covers California, Nevada, Arizona, Hawaii, Guam, the Northern Marianas Islands, and American Samoa. It's a huge amount of territory, lots of different disasters potential under that territory, typhoons, volcanoes, earthquakes, wildfires, really anything is possible. So needless to say, we're kept very busy all year round. And essentially, once you get past those permanent fixtures, headquarters, regional offices, whenever there is a disaster, we also have these temporary field offices, okay? And I'll get into kind of those in a minute, but essentially what those are is they're opened once a disaster takes place and it is declared. That's kind of where the local coordination occurs, because obviously you want to be closer to the action, more or less to affect an effective response. Okay, so our field offices. The JFOs, Joint Field Office, that's kind of the main office. When I think of FEMA field offices, that's really what I'm thinking of. It's joint because it's the central coordination point between FEMA, other federal partners, our state partners, local governments, tribal, territorial, NGOs, things like that. There's a central place for us all to come together and workshop issues and coordinate responses. You also have the Joint Information Center, and that is the central point of coordinating public information. So at FEMA, we have an external affairs arm. State emergency management agencies tend to have their own external affairs arm. And you want to make sure that whatever information you're putting forth, there's agreement between our state and federal partners. You have the most current and up-to-date, accurate information. So that becomes an important coordinating piece to make sure that we're getting the latest information, but also the most accurate information. That third box is supposed to say disaster recovery centers, or DRCs. Now, a DRC is an accessible and mobile facility that kind of spring up ad hoc during a disaster, and they're used as really FEMA sign-up sites. So if you have disaster survivors who need assistance, these kind of mobile spots will show up. People will come and kind of explain their situation, what kinds of, what they've been through. FEMA staff will explain what services are available, how to sign up, things like that, what programs are available to them, and it's an effective tool that way. I've been talking for a while, so I know I got another slide to get to or another presentation to get to, so I'm going to kind of skip a couple of these, but the area field office I want to talk about. So in the event that we have a disaster that covers a large geographic area, maybe one joint field office isn't really enough to cover that. And so we might set up these downstream offices that are called area field offices to help coordinate with specific instances. So thinking back to Puerto Rico, that's an island with 78 municipalities, each with their own mayoral and local government scheme, and often geographically isolated from one another with narrow and hard to access roadways. So it becomes really ineffective if you only have one field office to respond to all of those different municipalities. And so what we'll do is we'll create forward offices that target different geographic regions, and those can obviously reach back to our field office, which can then reach back to our regional office, back to headquarters, and so on. So it's a very deliberate scheme that way. It becomes an effective coordinating tool. All right, so I want to make sure I talk about this, our core values. We have 4 core values at FEMA: compassion, fairness, integrity, and respect. They're really the heart of what our agency and our employees stand for and represent. These values, it's really the foundation of who we are and what we believe in, and they're aspirational as well, right? When we're doing the kind of work we're doing, it's obviously very emotionally taxing, very stressful, especially in that first response phase. You're working 12, 13, 14-hour days every day without rest. That can become draining for anybody. And you kind of tend to lose sight. What am I doing here? Because you get just bogged down into the day-to-day, the minutia of whatever kind of assignment you've been tasked with. And so keeping that in mind, who we're here to help. And these values aren't really just expressed towards our disaster survivors, right? It's our colleagues, our coworkers, our state partners, our tribal partners. We try to embody that for everybody. And so we're constantly reminding ourselves, this is keeping these important components at heart. It's not the nitty gritty of making assistance handed out to folks, but it's still, it's a component of the type of people who do the work and what they want to embody when they go to work every day. So I think I have a little bit of time. So I want to talk about what I do as an attorney real quick. I've got 2 slides on our legal office, just so you get a sense of what it is I actually even do here. You might be wondering. So I am an attorney in the Regional and Field Operations Legal Division, otherwise called RFOLD. It's one of 8 legal divisions in OCC, and it's the largest of the legal divisions because unlike most OCC divisions, OCC stands for Office of Chief Counsel. It's where it's the arm of FEMA that all the attorneys tend to fall under. And unlike most other OCC divisions, we are all field or regional based. So we're kind of the operational arm that is responding to disasters directly with those legal issues that come up on the ground. And as a result of that, we're kind of like, especially think of us like in-house counsel, right? I know a little about a lot, right? I deal with a lot of different issues every day, but I am by no means a subject matter expert because it would be impossible given the types of issues that come up on the ground. So we are constantly coordinating with our headquarters counterparts who are typically embedded with FEMA programs. I'd mentioned, 2 programs, public assistance, individual assistance. There are actually 23 program areas within FEMA, and there are attorneys who work in all of those program areas. So it's a lot of different specialty that you need to have. And so we kind of have this broad breadth of information, but our depth is a little lacking, but it's kind of just it's the nature of the beast in the type of work we do. So our full attorneys are divided into 2 groups. We have the regional attorney and the deployable field counsel. I started out as a deployable field counsel. I am now in the regional side of things. And so typically the way it looks, again, we have 10 FEMA regions. There's a regional counsel and an assistant regional counsel in all 10 regions. And then depending on the region's specific needs, again, California and Region 9 as a whole is a very busy region. So we have additional staff attorneys. That's why I'm one of the additional staff attorneys with the region. And the type of work we do frequently, that's going to be disaster work. If a field attorney, a a deployable field counselor, DFC, is not assigned to a disaster, that'll come under our purview. Or if there is one, we will certainly coordinate to make sure that whatever the region's doing, what the field is doing is kind of meeting in the middle, and we're on the same page there. We also handle employment issues, issues related to headquarters programs, procurement and logistics issues. So procurement is the contracting arm of the government. Oftentimes, we need to get services from either another federal agency or a contractor of some kind. And then folks who request assistance specifically on the public assistance side of things, like if a state agency is carrying out debris removal, they're going to have to contract with someone to actually carry out that debris removal. And if they do, if they want FEMA assistance, they need to make sure that they are adhering to federal procurement rules as well. So there's a lot of oversight that's required as a result of that. It creates a lot of work for us, but it's also job security in a way too. Let's go to the DFCs. So DFCs work out of those temporary field offices I was mentioning before. We've got 23 of them. And essentially what they do is they have a residence of record somewhere in the United States, and they'll work from home until there's a disaster that springs up, and then we send them out. And we say, hey, there's a federal coordinating officer and the command staff at this particular disaster, they need legal support, and they will report to that office, provide counsel, reach back to the respective region that field office is geographically located in, and their work is specifically tied to disaster related issues. So that's going to wrap it up for me. I know there's a time allotted for questions later, but thank you so much for listening. I'm sorry if I spoke too fast or seemed a little out of sorts. It's my first time giving the presentation, so thank you for bearing with me. But it's very nice to meet you all. Thank you.
First time. You're pro, man.
It was great to see that.
Testing. Good morning, all. My name is Corey Williams, Public Information Officer with the U.S. Small Business Administration's Office of Disaster Assistance. I actually, I always like to kind of give my story of how I became an SBA employee, because one of the things is that, how do you get into disaster? So this was actually my first job out of law school. I went to law school at Thurgood Marshall School of Law at Texas Southern University. So what happened for me, we had the three ladies at that time we called Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. And they weren't lovely, as people said, but it was about 3,000 staff attorneys during that time period that were either law grads such as myself or recently passed the bar. And it was pretty crazy. I mean, we almost had a 24-hour operation, literally, in kind of covering those disasters. And of course, I transitioned over to field operations, and now I'm in public information. But it's been a great 16-year career, and I'm hopefully this information that I share with you over this next 21 minutes, because we're going to stay timely, will not be boring too much, but I'm going to get a lot of the high points, so that way we can kind of go through it a little bit faster. So again, like I say, I'm out of Field Operations Center West. We have 26 states in our territory, a lot of them in Region 9 with Adam, as well as the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, and all those other areas as well. So the biggest thing what we're going to talk about today in disaster preparedness is mitigation, because one of the big focuses, as Adam mentioned, is about resiliency and mitigation. So, for us, we have a 3-step plan: preparedness, recovery, and mitigation. So that's why it's very important for us throughout, having these opportunities to present in front of Professor Hamilton and all these disaster preparedness. We had a couple of our public information officers that were in Houston, so at a hurricane preparedness conference. So we're really big on being prepared, having that preparedness step. Now, it's not a matter of if, but it's when disaster will strike. So whether it's winter with Pacific Northwest floods, as we're dealing with right now, look at Montana right now. There's devastating floods in the, right near Yellowstone, or spring, Midwest and southern states with the flooding. We had a couple of administrative declarations in Texas, and then we just received a presidential declaration request from the state of Oklahoma for flooding that happened in the Muskogee tribal nations and some of those areas over there. March to July, tornado season, summer and fall wildfires, June 1st to November 30th, hurricane season. And of course, for us, September is going to be our National Preparedness Month. So we're very big on making sure, again, mitigation, resiliency, preparedness, because it's not if, it's going to be when disaster strikes, unfortunately. Now, one thing most people don't realize, that 25% of businesses don't open again after a disaster. And, for me, the tough part, I did a number of different presentations for Hurricane Harvey and, at chambers, economic development meetings. And it's tough to tell a small business owner, wow, look at this room, and a quarter of you are probably going to lose your business within 9 months. So it's somewhat surreal in the fact that what we want to do is prepare our businesses so we can hopefully overcome that 25% number. That's why, again, we really want to make sure we're just getting that messaging out, that it doesn't have to be the case. One of the things that we also emphasize is, and we'll get into this as well, is making sure that businesses have business interruption insurance. Anytime you get in front of a business owner, a small business owner especially, always, if there was one thing that you want to share with them, let them know that business interruption insurance could be one thing that could save their entire business throughout the course. So let's think about a situation where we have a mandatory evacuation period. Another hurricane hits, and we have a small pizza owner. I always like to give real life examples. So average revenue is about, let's just say $3,000 a day. So during that 6 days they're out for evacuation period, that's $18,000. So for Pizza Hut, for Little Caesars, who just got an NFL contract, that's easy for them to recoup that $18,000. But for Smith's Pizza Store, that is a lot harder. So that's why it's so important that if you have that business interruption insurance, whatever period of time that you may be out, you can not only get that actual coverage to kind of sustain the business, but also think about if a tornado totally destroyed the business. Well, you need to kind of continue to operate the business. So whether that's online, whatever kind of portal that you need to use, business interruption insurance is very critical during that aspect. Now, for us, disaster preparedness planning is in 6 steps. Establish communications plan, protect your vital information, review insurance coverage, very, very important for our homeowners. We'll really touch on that. Facilities and operations planning, business preparedness resources, and then of course, we want to make sure we kind of install it. We want to practice and test your plan with your business staff, and even test it with your family as homeowners and renters, different things like that. Now, again, establishing a communications plan. A communications plan is vital to your post-disaster recovery strategy. Important phone numbers, email addresses, any kind of deeds, any kind of other bills, anything written. You want to make sure, now a lot of times we have PDFs and different things, so we have it via electronically, but there are some of our small business owners who don't have QuickBooks, who don't have some of the the modern day things, the software to kind of keep their business operational. They may do things what we call old school now in 2022. So in that situation, if they have those kind of records like that, we just want to make sure that they have their list of their important vendors, because that could be very important. Because again, when a hurricane comes, it gives very little notice, and especially tornadoes, you just hear the sirens and here it comes. So, just making sure they have a book or something prepared to where they have that information at ready. Protecting that vital information. Again, you can arrange for off-site backup and storage of vital information and records. Many times, of course, we saw it firsthand during Hurricane Harvey and, of course, the Hill and Woolsey fires, where they have companies that specialize in coming in and reproducing certain documents and backing up different things. Because again, computers may burn, computers can be blown away by a tornado. So just make sure that, and again, we know sometimes for a small business, it may be tougher for them, but if they can't even have a hiring professional, one of their younger employees that kind of maybe a little more adapt to the computer software, that could be in lieu of hiring a professional information protection and storage company, someone that just has knowledge of serious, to actually save stuff on a USB drive, just something simple, that may be at the same cost. So we don't always want to have to go out of pocket and hire a professional. Now, reviewing insurance coverage. Now, again, I can't emphasize enough for a small business owner that business interruption insurance, again, it covers operating expenses in the event of business shutdown or any kind of mandatory evacuation. Anytime there's any kind of fire in the area, anytime there's a hurricane there, usually there's a minimum mandatory evacuation period of at least 3 to about sometimes 10 to 14 days, depending on what may happen. If it's severe flooding and there's not access to roads, it can be even longer, as case in point with Yellowstone right now. A lot of roads are washed away. You saw the little houseboat, which it actually ended up becoming a boat on the water. So, roads erode and different things like that. So again, it's so important, again, for those business owners to make sure that during the evacuation period, they have that business interruption insurance. And also, the biggest thing we try to emphasize as well, especially maybe not so much in California, but in our southern states, is flood insurance. Again, Adam touched on and did a great job about the National Flood Insurance Program. Many times as homeowners, though, when there's lender-placed insurance, what you don't see is that many times they don't have personal property coverage. They may have coverage to protect the lender. That's why it's lender placed. They're protecting their asset, but at the same time, as a homeowner, you have to realize you have a TV, you have furniture, you have beds, you have, video game systems. All those things need to be protected. So make sure as a homeowner and a renter that you have contents coverage. That's very important, because again, if there's a situation where there's any kind of damage and you have this lender placed policy and says, well, the mortgage company, they're happy. They're going to get their money. But how are you going to be made whole through that process if you have to replace everything? And then again, by having that flood insurance for your contents, you may not have to get a loan from us, or maybe be able to get a lesser amount of a loan. So it kind of takes that stress off of you as a homeowner. So that's why I really try to touch heavily on that, reviewing your insurance coverage. Again, facilities and operations planning. What if your business had to close for several weeks or months after disaster? We see it all the time, whether it's wildfires destroying a business, whether it's a tornado ripping through an entire city. You have to be prepared for your business to be closed for whatever period of time. Hopefully it's not any kind of a year, but I mean, we had situations in Harvey where there's businesses closed for over a year, and they had to almost recreate their business plan, do a lot more things online to kind of keep their business sustained. So that's why it's very important to make sure facilities and operations planning is a part of your preparedness strategy. Again, there's a lot of resources out there. The two that we really suggest already.gov, where we partner actually with FEMA in preparing actually a business plan. And then also our office open for business. Continue looking at business toolkits to keep your business operational during any kind of a disaster. And of course, with SBA, I'll be remiss if I didn't mention anything about the COVID declaration. Of course, we loaned over, I think, about $462 billion for COVID financing through our economic injury disaster loan program. So, a lot of people weren't ready for, a nationwide pandemic that could cripple our economy. So again, little things such as that business interruption insurance, if you talk to any small business owner and you tell them, that's probably the one biggest nugget that you can tell them to continue to keep their business operational. And test the plan. Make sure that disaster planning, just like there's any kind of continuity of operations planning, make sure that all the employees are on the same page. Hey, where's the USB with all of our deeds, with all of our bills, everything, with our vendor list, and things like that? Or do we have a company on hand where we can say, oh, we got this, we got a local company we're already based with. They already have everything saved on their drives. We're good to go. Now, recovery. Big part for us, and again, a major role of our administrator, Isabella Casillas-Guzman, has been to make sure that most people don't know, our programs not only help out businesses of all sizes, but homeowners, renters, and nonprofits. We offer low interest loans to help out anyone that may be in need. Now, of course, in a presidential declaration, in which Adam really covered, tremendously. So we also help out residents, businesses in declared counties, parishes in Louisiana, and any kind of tribal nations. The one thing I do want to mention is that there are a number of what we call administrative declarations, or what we call agency declarations, that you may not see all across the country where SBA is helping out. Case in point, in Texas right now, we had a couple of days that I'm sure, maybe you saw it, maybe for the news for like a day or so, they had an Eastland complex fire. So it wasn't big enough to meet the stature of a FEMA declaration. So for SBA purposes, all we have to have is at least 25 what we call majors. So that's a combination of businesses, nonprofits, homeowners, or renters that sustain major damage. And then under the power of our administrator, Isabel Casillas-Guzman, we can declare a lot of agency declarations. So many times you'll see that there's an SBA, what we call Disaster Loan Outreach Center, where we are, where we're actually, it's just SBA only, and we help people, like I say, in the field, homeowners, renters, businesses, and nonprofits kind of get on their feet from a disaster. Now, again, I talked about the EIDL program, which, there's a number of different EIDL programs in addition to our COVID program. We have governor certification, where there's economic impacts to small businesses, which includes any kind of fisheries, which is, very prevalent in more of the Pacific West states. California, we've had a lot of fishery declarations. Right now, I think we have a couple of governor certification request in the state of Washington. So that's, they don't make a lot of national news, but again, there's economic injury disaster loans, and all for a governor's cert, all we have to have is 5 businesses that state that they had some kind of economic injury from whatever declaration may be. Of course, we have we're in a big situation right now with drought. I probably draft about 15 drought press releases every week throughout our Western territories, and that's a huge area. I mean, now even in Texas, where it used to be rain plentiful in those areas with humidity, now they're dry, mainly a lot in South Dakota, Montana. There are a lot of California areas that have drought. We don't really do a lot of the military reservists, so I won't touch on that. Again, business and home loans. Homeowners can borrow up to $200,000 to repair, replace disaster damaged real estate, and up to $40,000 to repair, replace disaster damaged personal property. But one of the most important aspects that I really want to touch upon is that homeowners actually can borrow up to 20% of their total loss for mitigation measures. So one of the things, again, as a part of the mitigation and resiliency plan is when we build back, we want to build back stronger, whether it's a stronger roof or that's retaining walls or, of course, we always talk about the simple things, safe space, but what about the fire retardant, different things as far as, roof or, certain shutters. Like next week, I'm doing a presentation with the IBHS in Paradise. Of course, we know City of Paradise completely was devastated. So one of the things that we're going to see is a completely, fire. Well, I hate to say because, wildfires still can happen, but it's supposed to be as fire safe as possible. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. But again, using SBA funds, as a part of that program is hopefully to prevent and make that home more resilient through this process. Again, we talked about the loan limits. Again, I wanted to really just make sure I touched on the mitigation aspect because the previous presenter, you did a great job, by the way, talking about our program. So it makes my job easier. So again, we want to make recovery affordable. So the Small Business Act and additional laws provide SBA tools. Of course, we have low interest loans, flexibility to amortize our loans up to 30 years. And many times we offer nice deferment. So like with COVID idle, we have a 30-month deferment in place. And usually our loans are deferred at minimum for 5 months, but in major disasters, it's usually a minimum of 12 months, such as a Hurricane Harvey or any of the wildfires. You probably saw a 1-year deferment. So, and if there are certain situations where there is economic hardship, that can be handled on a case-by-case basis. Again, one of the biggest things we also emphasize is that we can't duplicate benefits either, similar to FEMA. So again, any kind of insurance recovery, that you have, again, that's always your first line of defense is having insurance. That's why, again, we always want to make sure that you have contents coverage on your homeowner insurance, contents coverage on your flood insurance, business interruption insurance. But in times like that, if there's any kind of uncompensated loss, that's where we can step in and make you whole in that situation. Same as FEMA, we have a 60-day deadline. And then for the economic injury, it's a 9-month deadline to apply. Again, we also look at repayment history, credit, we look at credit. And one of the biggest things that happens in recurring disasters, because one thing you probably see in the media all the time, and is case in point in the situation with Oklahoma, some of the same areas all the time flood. So this particular flooding incident that happened in Oklahoma was a request from Muskogee County, one of the tribal areas. They just flooded literally in 2019, same flood. So what we try to do is make sure that they have their flood insurance in place because they're in the flood zone A or V, which are considered mandatory flood bylaw zones. And if at any point they let that flood insurance lapse, they may be ineligible not only for SBA loans, but for FEMA assistance as well. So that's why we, it's really big to emphasize keeping that flood insurance in place. So we're getting closer to the 3 minutes. So I want to make sure I'm kind of tightening up. But the biggest thing also is long-term recovery. As we start to rebuild, all disasters will start local and they will end local. So that's why it's so important for us to partner with the local county emergency manager, any kind of our local SBA offices, our small business development centers, our SCORE offices for our businesses. We want to make sure we're playing a strong role in making sure that over the long term that our business owners are protected, our homeowners, renters are protected through this process. So again, on mitigation part, again, one thing we want to emphasize is that $1 spent on mitigation today defers an estimated $6 in future damages. So that's why it's so important to really take advantage of doing whatever you can to mitigate future losses, build back stronger, build back more resilient. If there was anything that I wanted to close with is that you look at that actual chart, if you can get 1 for 6, look, we go to Vegas, that's a win every day. So with that being said, we'll go ahead. I guess I'll pass it along to do the question and answer.
Yeah, question and answer. So Adam and Kendall are gonna come up and we'll do a question and answer period. If anybody has some questions.
There was a question on the.
Yeah, I think he, Skip mentioned there was one question. I don't know whose question it's gonna be. I'll just give it.
We did a question, right? So.
Are you actually have a question?
No, well, do you know what the question was online?
Yeah, I'm looking at the chat for this session.
So
And I'm not seeing any questions coming in for this session right here.
there was one for my session.
Yeah, I gotta figure that question. Adam would have it. Hang on one second.
Bear with us. We're pretending to be technologically inclined. In the meantime, does anyone physically present in the classroom have any questions? Make one up. Make us look really smart.
We got one.
Okay.
I have a question for you.
My question was about the reclamation letters, and I was just wondering how often do you encounter those? I guess personally, like how many clients have you seen, or is that very rare?
In terms of recoupment?
Yeah, recoupment. Well, generally speaking, it actually is relatively common. It's common for 2 reasons. One, at the end of the program, FEMA does this winding down thing, where basically there's often like a gap where they might go on for like 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, and generally it's related to housing. So let me just give an example because I'm making it sound more confusing than it is. But in Sonoma, we had a bunch of people that were living in FEMA trailers at the fairgrounds. And when FEMA was winding down the direct housing program, everyone got notices that were like, hey, our program is ending. If you need additional time to stay, the most time we can give you is 3 months, but you have to recertify. You had to do a few things and turn in documentation. A lot of people ignored it. And I think because they were overwhelmed, quite frankly, didn't know where they were going to go. They hadn't really planned for this. And FEMA doesn't like come and make sure you found another place to live. That's on the community, right? As well as the individual survivors. So when that happened, people were like, okay, fine. Some got out very last minute, but once you overstay your welcome, they attempt to recoup those funds because that trailer is essentially used past the deadline. And I mean, they do warn you about it, but that was one of the major issues we saw with recoupment, where a ton of people basically got fined because they theoretically lived there past the deadline. And they thought like, okay, well, whatever, try and come after me. Well, they do. They send, I don't know if you want to talk on this or you, but they send you to the Treasury and then to a third-party contractor who's not easy to deal with. So do not let people get in that position.
It is not an issue that I deal with directly, but I kind of vaguely know about it. But yeah, it's if there's a point where we have an issue, where folks stay beyond their allotted time in a temporary housing unit, they will continue to be charged rent that way. And I mean, it just accumulates and accumulates. And we obviously give notice of these things, but for whatever reason, some folks, they don't have anywhere else to go. And so it can create a real financial burden on disaster survivors once the programs come to an end.
And one of the things that sort of goes with that hand in hand too was that we had the question come up of, does FEMA have to abide by eviction protections? Because we don't have local eviction protections per se, but we have state eviction protections. And obviously some localities do have local eviction protections. So it's our stance, they do have to abide by this. And FEMA agreed. So that means that FEMA also can't kick you out. So if that person stays there, FEMA's not going to take the time and investment, at least they haven't thus far, to like require Adam to go down, file an unlawful detainer notice with the court, go and serve the individual, and then, show up in court if the individual doesn't get out to argue about it. Generally, they don't take it down to that kind of local level. So when people stay, they just keep racking up costs for quite some time. And the only way out of it, from what I've been told, is literally pay something, right? Pay it all back. And or if you can establish that you would never in your entire lifetime be able to repay it, which is like, I don't even know how one would prove that. So, but beyond that, recoupment for a mistake, it does happen. We've been seeing it recently in Santa Cruz and in Ukiah, Mendocino, so in more rural areas, where apparently there wasn't really a strong determination about primary occupancy. They thought that there was, but there wasn't. So somebody got, like $3,500 is their first and last for to go out and find a place to live in. But they never went beyond that in the certification process. So FEMA thinks like, okay, well, you didn't need this, you didn't certify. They actually may have valid primary occupancy, but because they didn't work through the process, FEMA now thinks they got money that they weren't eligible for. So they've been coming back, and people have been having a difficult time trying to prove their title as well as their primary occupancy, especially in areas where there's more than one parcel in any given APN number, right? So any given property, if there's more than one improvement that sits on the property, it becomes problematic. The good thing is though, after the DRA, those individuals can now request a hearing. And ironically, I think beneficially because of COVID, those hearings can also be remote. So you get your day in court per se, but you don't have to figure out how to get an incredibly vulnerable client to Sacramento or something like that. You just have to figure out how to get them internet access, which is a lot easier to do. Emily?
I have a question about mitigation. So when you said that 20% of your SBA loan could be directed towards hardening your home, is that mostly for partial losses then? So because if a whole structure is down for whatever reason, you'd have to build up to building code, correct?
Well, yes, so you would build up the building code, but the one thing is, and this is one thing that happened with Boulder, Colorado, with their wildfires. So one of the program, we actually, had to increase the replacement cost value due to the cost of homes in that Boulder area. So there was actually, so most homeowners, and I probably should touch on this a little bit more, they don't have RCV or what's called replacement cost value in their policy. So when if they have a standard policy, let's say $300,000 for their home, and then let's say they have $40,000, but now due to COVID, cost of supplies and machinery and different things, now you're looking at possibly to rebuild, maybe $500,000. So that again creates a shortfall, that $200,000. So in many instances, it's not just for partial loss, it could be for full loss, because in certain areas, like let's say we're in a hurricane area. And at that time, let's say the flood zone level, they need to be 6 feet at that time. But then when they rebuild, that they determine maybe they need to be 12 feet above sea level, just to make sure to protect themselves. So it can cover not only that actual partial loss, but it can be a full loss if there's new changes in code or new changes in regulations. So mitigation, I think, is good for both. You might have to follow up on it.
One
Yeah.
little follow-up.
Yeah.
Is that in addition to the 200,000?
That's in addition to the 200,000. So it's 20% of the total loss. And it's up to, I think it's up to 300,000. I want to say is the max with the mitigation included. I kind of passed over, right here. Yeah. So it's actually 20% up to 200,000. So they can actually get up to 400,000 if it includes mitigative measures. No problem.
I found your question. How much I'll hear? That'd be.
So the question is there a minimum amount of time a survivor must have primary residence in the disaster declared area to be eligible for individual assistance, in particular renter's assistance and personal property assistance? Can a survivor be eligible for IA if they move to the disaster area within a week or month of the disaster? Ooh, that is a tough, oops.
I could have tried to say.
That is a tough question. In theory, the answer is yes. However, it's still going to be very difficult to prove that that's your primary occupancy. So you would need to not have a primary connection with any other place nearby. So if you still had a leasehold, you would need to show that that leasehold was completely severed before the disaster started. If you're like moving while the disaster is going on or something, you're going to have a very hard time establishing primary occupancy. So I would say there's not a specific time limit, but the closer in time you are, the sketchier FEMA is going to think you are being when they're reviewing your application. Did you want to?
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, that's a great point. I do not know of a specific time requirement. I think as long as you can, from my understanding is as long as you can establish some kind of residency there, then we will deem you to be residing in that area. The problem is oftentimes the folks most impacted by disasters have the hardest time demonstrating residency. And so they run into all these extra hurdles doing so. And I know FEMA has recently taken efforts, every 4 or 5 years, we have a strategic plan that gets announced, and we're in the middle of our 2020, I believe it's 2022 to 2026. One of our primary focuses is equity. And we implemented a new policy this past year where we are lowering the bar for demonstrating occupancy and residency in badly hit areas, because we found that the folks most impacted by these disasters don't necessarily have the documentation that we've demonstrated. So if there's a proof of like a home repair, for instance, that you have a bill of sale from like maybe a contractor or something doing work on your house, that might suffice as opposed to demonstrating specific title or your leasehold on something. And the reason is because oftentimes in kind of more rural areas, ownership is passed a bit more informally. I mean, especially, and that's an issue that crosses racial lines. It has huge impacts for some of the more disadvantaged members of our communities. And so taking that into account, we've taken some initial steps to help rectify that. And there's still a long way to go, of course, but that's just kind of some of the issues that we're working on overcoming right now.
FEMA has a published list of those things on their website. One of the things that now counts that didn't before is a letter from your postmaster. So obviously it requires that you get mail at your house, but as long as you get mail there, your postmaster can write a letter saying that you live there, or that they know somebody lived there and they drove X car and this is your car. Like, you can be creative with the ways that you can get around this. And the same is from a county supervisor or a member of your city office or government. So they can write a letter saying, yes, this person lives here. And quite frankly, it seems like, well, how the heck would they know if I lived somewhere, right? But the truth is they have more of an investment in helping make sure everyone gets the benefits that they need. So their office is likely to do that work to find out and identify, yes, we know that, Joe Smith lived in this unit and it was his primary place of residence. And you don't need to get too caught up on the home ownership thing versus rentership thing in terms of the title necessarily, because it doesn't always matter. You're still eligible for the same benefits, if that makes sense, whether you rented or whether you owned. Like you still caps out at the same amount. The biggest thing is the primary occupancy. Can you establish that you physically lived there and it was your primary place of residence at the time of the disaster, and that you don't have, an alternative residence to move into down the street, if that makes sense. And Andrew, did you have a question?
Yeah, so in January of 2021, the president signed an executive order advancing racial justice and social equity in all levels of government. Has that, I guess, has it cascaded directly to the work you all are doing? And if so, have you seen any impact of that yet?
No.
For us, yes. One of the biggest missions that we've had under our new administrator, Casillas Guzman, is to really make sure we're serving our underserved communities. And one of the biggest, examples right now is the state of New Mexico. They had the fire that was in, still it's a presidential declaration. And one of the things that our public information officers are actually emphasizing is not only speaking to the tribal nations, but any of those different chambers, such as African-American chambers, Hispano chambers. So we really want to make sure we're emphasizing serving our underserved communities. And, so I think that's probably even just a example, real life example right now. Adam, do you want to touch on anything?
Sure. Yeah. So I mentioned our strategic plan a minute ago. Again, it evolves and changes every 4 or 5 years or so, but the primary goal, and there's usually 3 or 4 goals as part of the strategic plan, and the primary goal is, for our current strategic plan is equity. And again, we had this equity sprint in our IA program that took place late last year, and that was what really implemented these new kind of lessened requirements, less stringent requirements in terms of how to demonstrate residency. There's still certainly much more that we have to do, but that's just kind of an initial action that kind of reflects your question.
Anyone else?
You guys are exactly 12:15.
Yes.
Here, I think one person.
About to raise my hand,
Go, David.
and I don't want to keep everybody over time.
One question not gonna hurt. You're good.
Is there consultation services available? So before a disaster strikes, somebody can get help mitigating what may be coming down the pike? Is there somebody to review insurance policies, help them afford insurance policies? Advise whether their building needs gutters or where to get a generator, et cetera, et cetera. Is there a way to prepare? Is there some professional consultative advice available to prepare?
So maybe you all can speak to this a bit better than I can, but I know, for instance, our ready.gov website is really the kind of first stop for those kinds of issues. It's really about preparation in advance, kind of understanding what services are available. I'm not incredibly familiar with all the resources on that website and what they offer, but I know that the intended purpose of it is to kind of help for that preparation and mitigation. Maybe you all can speak to it.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to Adam's point is also that we have small business development centers. We also have our SCORE chapters that help our local businesses. A lot of people don't realize that those SBDCs, those SCORE chapters, women's business centers, all those are free services that are out there for our business owners. And, I actually, I think the catering company that's taking care of the event today, I was like, we were able to help them through the COVID Idol program, but I was like, look, let's look to scale. Let's look to grow. Go talk to the Women's Business Center. There may be programs out there. Go, link up with our local Small Business Administration office, wherever and probably for this one would be LA, but wherever they are, there's always access to a Small Business Development Center, one of our SBA district offices, SCORE chapter, Women's Business Center. I think there's 2 Women's Business Centers, I want to say, in the LA area, if I'm not mistaken. I think one in the Santa Barbara area, I think one in LA, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a number of resources for our small business, owners to be able to take advantage of that they just may not know that are out there, and they're free of charge.
And then I would just add that generally mitigation and preparedness are really responsibilities that fall to obviously the individual, but then the local and state government. So the federal government doesn't work a ton with that kind of preparedness. They do like infrastructural preparedness, if that makes sense, but not like Kendall needs help. Where does Kendall go? So like in Sonoma County, we're doing a series in conjunction with literally the county of Sonoma at local libraries to bring preparedness forth. Counties are going to be responsible for mitigation preparedness, like literally what can I do to my house to keep it safer? There's a lot of state programs that provide funding for those kinds of things. So that piece generally comes from the county. And then the legal piece is gonna come from a CBO. So like legal aid, like United Policyholders, they do a lot of preparedness work. But I will say that there's not just like one group that goes out and does it all, which I think we're moving in that direction. But unfortunately, it's gonna vary county to county at this point.
I'd add to that, you know, it's difficult to have like an overarching thing. We're talking about a lot of different kinds of hazards, and mitigating your home from wildfire is completely different than flood, which is completely earthquake. And those all have 3 different insurance policies as well. And so it's, you know, there is something to be said about, we have to know what our risks are. And then also, you know, a lot of times when we're having the preparedness conversation, we're talking about, you know, making sure that people can survive the disaster. Like that's the most important thing. And, you know, if you don't have enough money to even buy renter's insurance, you know, you want to make sure that you can do little things just so that you and your family survives. I think.
Next, we have lunch at 12:30, and it's going to be outside. So this is the direction.
Because we're actually just doing like a day trip. I'm gonna go get a G car and then we're gonna drive up in the morning and just go see it. And I was like, so, you know, yeah. Mason, do you want to come meet?